Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being a part of this virtual event. I'm Ken Corts, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Interim Dean of the Rotman School of Management. All of us panelists and attendees alike are joining this virtual event from dispersed locations, of course, but we are brought together by our connection to the Rotman School and to U of T. And as such, we wish to acknowledge the land on which U of T operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Welcome to the 9th webinar in our series, Managing Uncertainty, Adapting to and Learning from the COVID-19 Crisis. Our goal with this series is to bring the Rotman community together and offer our evidence-based perspectives and advice to help you cope with the dramatic changes taking place as a result of this pandemic. Today, we want to talk about how to build back better, why corporations need a radical redesign. And while we're talking about radical redesign and the need to build back a stronger society, one thing the world is currently paying very close attention to is the racism embedded in many of our institutions, as demonstrated by the Black Lives Matter protests happening worldwide. I know we'll be keeping that in mind today as our conversation unfolds, and we know for certain that the current crisis has highlighted many structural inequalities in our society. While much of Canada remains under emergency closures and distancing restrictions, it's not too early to turn our thoughts to what will happen once restrictions are lifted. This is a unique opportunity to challenge some of our previous practices and to tackle some of the larger problems we were struggling with long before coronavirus ever hit. Joining me in this conversation today are Professors Sarah Kaplan and Su-Min To. Sarah Kaplan is the Director of the Institute for Gender and the Economy, Distinguished Professor of Gender and the Economy, and Professor of Strategic Management at Rotman. She and her work have been featured in a wide array of major media outlets, and she has co-authored and authored best-selling books, including her recently published The 360-Degree Corporation: From Stakeholder Trade-offs to Transformation. Her current work focuses on applying an innovation lens to understanding the challenges for achieving gender equality. Su-Min To is Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and at the Rotman School. Her research primarily seeks to understand how our natural tendencies to stick with familiar ways of interacting with others and familiar ways of perceiving our environments cause us to miss important opportunities for leadership, for cooperation across groups, and for building success and well-being for individuals, organizations, and nations. Thank you both for joining us today. Before we begin this discussion, I want to invite the audience to submit any questions they might have using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can in the second half of our hour together today. So Sarah, I wanted to start with you and kind of ask this kind of context setting question for you. I think many of us have spent the last few months saying to ourselves and to each other, I can't wait till things are back to normal. So in that context, why are some people, including you, starting to talk about building back better instead of getting back to normal?
Well, thanks so much for including me in this session today, Ken. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on being our dean at the Rotman School. I am really thrilled to be in this conversation, in part because I think I too have that instinct of like, oh, I wish things were just normal again. But as you pointed out in the introduction, one of the things that both the COVID crisis as well as the Black Lives Matter protests that are going on around the world points out is that normal was not necessarily so great for a lot of people. And when we think about who's really suffered the most in the COVID crisis, if we think about who essential workers are, they're often people who haven't had the same opportunities and privileges as, for example, those of us who are on this seminar today. And so if we want to think about, well, what can we do going forward? I think the answer can't be, it's just to go back to where we were. The answer has to be, we have to pay attention to these inequalities that have always been there, but for many people in positions of leadership or privilege, we haven't always seen them or paid attention to them or invested in them or did something to address the fact that these shouldn't be normal. The inequalities in our society shouldn't be normal. The degradation of the environment shouldn't be normal. All of these kinds of things that people consider to be kind of social goods, I think we have to now say, look, these have to be part of the rebuild. They can't be. Getting back to normal means that we are not going to be fixing environmental problems, fixing social inequalities, fixing gender inequality. And so that's why I've been arguing for that, among other people, and why I'm excited to have this conversation with Sue Min and you today.
Great, thanks. Can you describe a little more about how the current crisis has highlighted or exacerbated even inequalities in our society, especially with respect to the workforce, maybe?
Yeah, so looking at the workforce, I think a couple things are very obvious. First of all, unlike many other recessions, more women than men have lost their jobs in this context, and there's several different reasons for that. One is the structure of the labor market, which is women are much more likely to be in part-time work. Women are much more likely to have been the most recently hired. Women are much more likely to be in sectors such as hotels and other kinds of things like that, where that have been the most affected. And so that's one aspect. The second aspect is that because children, this is an unusual crisis in the sense that children are not in school, and normal caretaking, daycare and things like that aren't available even for people who typically would have daycare. And so there's now this demand for extra caregiving at home. And because we live in such a gendered society, most of that has fallen into the hands of women. And so we're getting many women who are actually being forced to drop out of the workforce because of their caregiving responsibilities. And so I think this crisis, unlike maybe a typical recession, has been sort of a triple amplification for women workers, and also people that we now see are the essential workers, who tend to be racialized, new immigrants, and people like that. So those are a couple ways in the workforce that we're seeing that how COVID has really exacerbated inequalities, and also just showed us what those inequalities already were.
Sue Min, I want to ask you about crises in general. What have we learned from past crises? And what can you tell us about how effective crisis management works? What does that look like? And how should businesses be thinking about starting to recover from this crisis?
Yeah, and I think, sort of building on what Sarah already said earlier, I think this is a good opportunity to open up the conversation, to trigger conversation about what is possible and what change needs to happen. And it's a time to think differently. And we can see that, radical change is possible, given that governments, organizations, individuals have had to change quite dramatically. So we know it's possible. And so this has opened up, this crisis has opened up an opportunity for us to look at that. And also in terms of building back better, we've all suffered sort of a major trauma, and with huge disruption in our lives and in the workplaces. So it's not just enough to go back to normal. And we have to be ready. We have to build resilience in preparation for the next crisis, the next pandemic, or the climate crisis. And so, what do we learn from past crises? Well, we know that it's disruptive, it's rare, it's critical. It always requires an urgent response, and so people react to that, often emotionally, and people look for answers, clarity, look to their leaders, who are really the faces in these crises, right? So we look at our prime minister and our CEOs and our presidents to tell us what to do and to reassure us. And so first of all, these crises evoke huge emotions and the need for direction and clarity. And so in responding to crises, it's important for leaders and individuals to not just be concerned about what they have to do, but also about the emotions that they're experiencing, the fears, frustrations, the shock. And so what we learn from crisis is that we have to take care of both parts of any organization and people. We have to care about what they're doing and also how they feel. And so the role of leadership is even more important here. And for us to be adaptive, to be resilient, leaders have to be responsive and show support. And unfortunately, at a time like this, that's often more rare, more difficult, because we're all under a lot of stress. Leaders are under a lot of stress, and we're on sort of survival mode, and we're under this sort of huge threat environment. And so it's it's important for leaders to show support, to listen to their employees, to show concern, and provide the direction and emotional support that I already mentioned.
Great. Thanks. Sarah, I wanted to kind of ask you about your Fast Company article that you wrote called What It Means for Businesses to Build Back Better After COVID-19. And in that article, you talked specifically about kind of three elements to that building back. You talked about how that relates to the workforce, to corporate strategy, and to corporate governance. So I thought together we can kind of take a step through each of those three. So maybe I'll come back to you, Sarah, and talk about what does it mean to build back better with respect to the workforce in the first instance.
Well, yes, I think a lot of the things we've already been talking about really emphasize the issues that are with the workforce. So if we now realize how essential workers are, then this question about what level should minimum wage be, how much should essential workers be paid in the United States, for example, there's a big debate about whether there should be a $15 minimum wage, which puts people, even if they work full time, basically at the poverty level. Thinking about if these truly turn out to be the people we're most dependent on, the Amazon warehouse workers, the grocery workers, and things like that, why are those the people who are being paid the least in our society? So I think that's one thing that the conversation is going to have to shift about what counts as a minimum wage that is effective for people. The second thing is that it's completely clear that this crisis has uncovered the importance for flexible work. It's something that many companies say that they have, but then the people who take advantage of flexible work are often seen as, quote, less committed or something like that. But now we realize the reason people need flexible work is because they have obligations at home. And that's becoming much more apparent as we see people having to work double shifts at home because of kids and shifting off if they're lucky enough to have a second parent in the home, shifting off between the parents and who works when and all that kind of stuff. So previously, I think flexible work was seen as something like a benefit you could offer to women who had these other demands, as opposed to an essential way that we need to think about working. And I think the final argument that I made in that Fast Company article, and I think is crucial, is that it is this whole crisis when it comes to workforce has uncovered the deep importance of universal healthcare, but also, in which we have in Canada, but also universal childcare. And universal childcare means everyone having affordable access to having their children cared for. And that is, we already knew that when we were talking about gender equality in society, that one of the reasons that women are siphoned off of the workforce is because of lack of childcare. But now we're seeing it much more importantly, how that is going to be crucial for building back, not just for the people who need the childcare, but also the childcare workers who turn out to be essential workers and are often some of the lowest paid people in our society.
Mm-hmm. Sumin, do you want to add anything to that around what does it mean to build back better with respect to the workforce?
Yeah, so I think building back better means a lot of things. I think it has to be taken in a very broad perspective, and I think that relates to any sort of problem we're trying to solve, any sort of crises that we're facing now. I think it requires sort of a very broad systems thinking and realizing, and I think this crisis has made it clear that many of these things we're interdependent, right? We can't have a thriving business without a healthy workforce and without a good environment, a supportive government that allows that to happen. And so the other thing that we also can see is that the quick fixes that we have been necessary, but they sometimes also have long-term consequences, negative consequences. And so some things that Sarah mentioned earlier with like layoffs and how that disproportionately affects women and minorities, that needs to be looked at more carefully, and also for organizations to realize that these things have sort of long-term consequences, and that and they don't necessarily lead to greater resilience, and important priorities like equity, diversity, and inclusion can't take a backseat at this point.
I just want to, if you don't mind, Ken, build on Sumin's point, because research has shown that's looked at not this COVID current pandemic, but previous situations where there have been mass layoffs and furloughs, and it's definitely been a destroyer of diversity in organizations. And even if people aren't trying to be they're applying quote, supposedly neutral rules to layoffs, like we're just going to lay off the most recently hired people, or we're just going to lay off the part-time workers, or we're just going to lay off workers in certain job categories. Unfortunately, because a lot of those things are gendered implicitly, because women are much more likely to be in part-time work or more recently hired, what you get is, even if you apply supposedly neutral rules, you often get killing off of diversity inside organizations. And so, as Suman said, you literally have to have diversity and inclusion as a central decision-making component when you're making even these choices in the middle of a crisis, or you're going to end up with organizations that all the good work that we have done, which has not nearly been enough, but the work that we have done over the past few decades is going to be destroyed by some short-term emergency choices.
Mhm.
Great, thank you. And then the second pillar of that, Sarah, was talking about what does it mean to build back better in strategy, in firm strategy. What can you say about that?
Well, when we think about, for example, in the United States, the Business Roundtable last August made an announcement that they were going to forego shareholder primacy and, pay attention to the needs, as they said, create value for the needs of other stakeholders. And in Canada, after what's known as the BCE decision in 2008, there's been an understanding that corporations are allowed to care about other stakeholders and not just the shareholder. And yet, I think basically we haven't made good on any of that, it's still really a shareholder primacy world. And so when we think about building back better, we also have to think about, well, how would you actually make good on a promise to create value for all stakeholders? And thinking about how you even understand who are all the stakeholders who are affected by your business, and how your operations are actually leading to negative consequences that you might not have considered. What I propose in the article is that people look to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because those already lay out some very well negotiated, well thought out principles that have to do with the environment, that have to do with the workforce, that have to do with equal access to education and things like that, that I think could easily be used as a guidepost for companies. And they need to think about, okay, if we're going to build back better, and if we're going to make good on these promises to care about other stakeholders, then we have to consider those range of issues.
Mm-hmm. And Suman, do you want to chime in on that? Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we need to, in order to build back better, we need to be listening, and leaders need to be talking to their people to understand what their needs are. And I think this has been a good opportunity for people to sort of step back and think about what are priorities, what are important, how do we be the company that we want to be, and provide value for everyone involved. So all the stakeholders involved, the prosperity and health and safety of everyone. So it requires deep reflection, and also perspective taking on who we are really trying to serve, what are we trying to achieve, and and again, that brings back to having an inclusive environment, diversity in our organizations, so that we're not just listening to other people who think like us already. We need to be taking the perspective of others, take counsel from other people who are not like us, to come up with important and creative ways to build back better.
Great. And of course, these issues that you both raise about accountability, whether the accountability is to shareholders or to a broader set of stakeholders, those are they kind of take us into that third domain of governance, because we think of governance as being kind of the mechanism by which boards and so on maintain that accountability to those stakeholders and shareholders. So that is the kind of the third leg of that argument in the article from Sarah. What can either of you say about what it would mean to build back better in terms of governance, maybe governance practices, governance bodies, the composition of boards, and kind of that side of governance that might help to make real this renewed commitment to a broader accountability to multiple stakeholders?
Well, I'll just start and say that, when we think about boards of directors and holding them holding companies accountable, and the mechanisms that we have to hold boards of directors accountable, people default to this, what's called the business judgment rule. And if they can prove, the board can prove somehow that they have exercised good business judgment, then they can't be held accountable for damages or other things like that. But the question is, what counts as good business judgment? We again have had a default of saying, well, if we consider what the impact on profits and loss or impact on the shareholders, that counts as good business judgment. I think going forward, that's not going to be satisfactory. That good business judgment is going to require many of the things that Sue Min is talking about, which is this broad consultation, this making sure that you have a diverse set of viewpoints, that you're actually doing your due diligence and asking yourself the incredibly hard questions. And if boards aren't asking questions of the management about the impact on the environment and global warming, if they're not asking questions, one of the things that's come up in discussion in the United States is the fact that a lot of labor that goes into Idaho potatoes or McDonald's uniforms is actually prison labor. And so the question is the board asking, are we benefiting from prison labor? As an example, these are the kinds of questions that boards are going to be expected to be asking and are going to be held accountable for answering. And so I think the definition of business judgment is going to radically change.
Yeah, and I think the question about how we're treating our workforce is going to be absolutely front and center, because as we know, we require great flexibility from our workforce and a lot of understanding and sort of cooperation, and to the extent to which the leaders of the organization can build that, engender trust and that kind of environment, that kind of culture, that organization will do better in the long run. So I think boards need to be thinking about that, and they should be held accountable in that regard.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Can I just say,
yeah,
Ken,
Sarah,
I see in the Q&A, people are asking for the link for the article, which hopefully the team can post, but if they can't, if you literally Google Build Back Better and Fast Company, you'll be able to find the article. So in case it's not possible for us to post the link, you should be able to quite easily find it.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Sue Min, I wanted to come back to you for a second. I know that you've talked about the recovery from this crisis as being an innovation challenge. Can you talk a little bit about how framing recovery as an innovation challenge can be a useful lens for managers to think about the problem?
Yeah, so I think when we think about innovation, we think of something that involves change and involves some improvement. And I think more importantly, as an innovation challenge, as we know, innovation and changes need to be sustainable. They have to have a buy-in and really thinking about it from a broad perspective. And given that where we are right now, this shock and the disruption that has caused people to reevaluate their assumptions, their routines, and so on. So it's a great opportunity for that. I think one of our colleagues at Rotman, Alberto Galasso, talks about this and about how the pandemic has been a boon to innovation when customers are more open to ways of interacting. And so taking this from an innovation perspective, and more importantly, a sustainability perspective is really important. And I think it kind of builds on what Sarah has also been talking about. So taking a very broad perspective, looking at the environment, looking at the social needs of society, and also what the role of government is, and making sure that we're not just focused on one part of a problem, like trying to get back, have regain economic activity, have our business thriving again, but to also think about it in terms of how a workforce needs to be taken care of, and how all of these things at this point need to be considered as a system, as parts of the system. And in order to optimize the entire system, we need to look at how these parts of the system relate to each other, and to look at making a few big sustainable changes that will ultimately result in the systemic change that we need.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to kind of bring in one question here from the Q&A. We're not quite to where we're going to tackle the Q&A head on, but one question popped up there that's really related to what we've been talking about. And I just wanted to highlight that a bit. And that was, someone was asking us to address how this relates to the concept of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance factors. And I think we've kind of, we've talked all around that, but none of us had used those three letters exactly like that. What do you think? Does this kind of highlight the importance of the ESG movement? Does COVID kind of put a kind of spotlight on the importance of the ESG frameworks that many boards and senior executives use to think about their accountability to kind of non-traditional, or their kind of non-traditional considerations in the success of their business?
Well, I can jump in there just because I think, yes, absolutely. We haven't used the term ESG, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the environment, we're talking about social considerations, and we're talking about governance. And I think the challenge has been, up until now, is that ESG has always been, or you could also say corporate social responsibility, all the different acronyms, ESG, CSR, you pick it, have always been seen as side of the desk issues, nice to have, add-ons, something that you do on top of your day job. And what this is pointing out, the crisis is pointing out, that in fact, they have to be central to your job. And in fact, by making them central to your job, you're actually going to spur more innovation, because by considering these diverse points of view, these diverse issues, the tensions and trade-offs that I've also written about in my book that you mentioned, Ken, the 360 Corporation. If you consider those, you actually come up with more innovative ideas. And so it directly ties into Sue Min's point, which is this is a moment for innovation. And in fact, by considering these issues, you will actually become more innovative.
Right. So for companies to build back, and I think one of the comments that I see from the question and answers is that, we have this pressure to turn profits again, to get, the engines of our companies back on. But you can't do that if your workforce doesn't feel safe, right? Or unwilling to come back to work, or feel or stressed, and are not or not in optimal or feeling productive, right, to come back to work. So that's going to be counterproductive. In fact, could be much more costly for organizations to try to get back. And so I think, we those things can't be divorced from each other. We have to think about these things holistically, and how do we ensure that people are not pressured to return to work and put themselves at risk and put the companies at risk. And so yeah, absolutely. We have to look at this from a more holistic perspective.
Yeah. I think for my part, it's really highlighted the interrelatedness of these kinds of issues, right? So you think about something like workplace conditions and worker safety. The side of the desk view might be that's important because we want to do the right thing by our workers. But what this pandemic has illustrated is it's not only the workers who care about the workers, the customers care about the workers, the customers care about the safety of the products and services, which in turn depend on the safety of the workers. Business continuity depends on the workplace conditions and the health and safety of the workers. And so whether you're thinking about the business case or the right thing to do or customer reputation, it's really interrelated. And I think that ESG framework kind of highlights some of those considerations and the fact that they really are interrelated. The different constituencies and stakeholders' interests are intermingled very deeply.
Can I just add one thing on the point about innovation and ESG? Companies often put their best and brightest people on the innovative, like creating a new product or new service. Innovation is seen as difficult. You put smart people on it. You invest for the long term because it's hard. You accept that there'll be many failures because you're trying new things, and you make that a really paramount kind of effort for investing. And yet somehow we don't accept the same kind of dimensions when we think about ESG issues. We don't want it to be hard. We don't want there to be failures. We don't want that, it to be risky and those kinds of things. But in fact, if we apply the innovation lens, as Sue Min has suggested, I think we also give ourselves much more freedom to experiment and to learn and to engage with all of these various stakeholders to come up with new ideas. So I think the innovation mindset is really crucial for this.
Yeah, and I don't think companies have a choice at this point, too. I mean, the expectations of our workers have changed, our customers have changed. And so you can't not be thinking differently about how you're responding to your customers and to your workforce. So the whole social contract has changed, and yeah, so we're kind of in a situation where it's necessary.
Great. So let me kind of move to I think what is really maybe the big question that we haven't confronted yet, and that is lots of great ideas, lots of reasons to be energized and aspirational about what we might make out of this crisis. But how do we actually do it? What are the first steps, first concrete steps managers can take to start to put some of these ideas into practice?
So I think this is a really important question, because I think, as Sumin said, we're already in a period of crisis where we're looking to the leaders to provide this clarity of leadership, and yet the leaders themselves are feeling stressed and under pressure. And so how do you, in that moment, also think of all of these dimensions of the issues that we've been talking about? I think that there's some practical steps, which is convening with the board of directors and having the board of directors ask some very serious questions about all of these different stakeholders and make sure that they've considered these kinds of issues. I saw in the chat or the Q&A a question about, should we be doing after action reviews of the response so far to the pandemic? And I think absolutely, I think every company should go back and really examine the lessons learned from this experience and figure out, well, what worked and what didn't work as we go forward. Because we know, actually, research shows that companies that invest in corporate social responsibility in the different dimensions of workers or their supply chain or the environment are actually the ones that are more resilient in periods of crisis. And so for companies that have struggled, this may be a wake-up call for them. So I think the first thing is to really start having these serious conversations, and as policies are being implemented, take into account some of the kinds of questions that Sumin was raising about whether or if you're having to do furloughs, really being thoughtful about who is actually getting furloughed, and are you topping up the salaries or the hourly wages of people who are providing essential work but are putting themselves at physical risk to do that? These are all kinds of questions that can be asked almost immediately.
Yeah, and I think back to where we started, I think where it's really important for leaders to listen, to engage with their workers, their employees, with their stakeholders. We need to think about what even leadership means, right? How we train our leaders, how we've been through this time where we were under a lot of stress because it was all new, managing our employees, how do teams work, how do they work with each other, and so on. It's a good time to think about how we manage our workforce, how we strategize, how we do business, right? And as Sarah says, this is a good time to take stock of what has gone well, what has worked really well, what have opened up opportunities that were otherwise not there before, or we thought was not possible, and to look at what are some of these things that can be sustained. The companies have been talking about how the 4-day work week or working remotely is going to stay. Will that work for your organization? This is a conversation that needs to happen with your workers and the people around you. And it's important as well because this is going to require their buy-in. And so again, companies that are already strong in building trust and communicating and supporting their workforces will be able to harness the learning. And that has to be a deliberate process, and it's very easy to go back to wanting to be the way things were and have our routines, and we feel familiar and comfortable, but this process of learning and taking stock has to be very deliberate and sustained.
And I mean, just think about, this is very much related to Sumin's research, so I'm basically stealing some of her ideas here, but we have this tendency to want to, as she said, feel comfortable, but think about what's happened. Like, okay, we've talked about this before at the Rotman School. We've been debating for years about whether we should do online learning, blah, blah, blah. Between March 13th and March 16th, we took all of our courses from being in person to online, and we did it over a weekend, right? Things that we couldn't imagine, like the Minneapolis city council is now basically put a plan in to abolish the police force and recreate it. Things that we could not have imagined 2 months ago or 3 months ago, we're doing it almost at a turn of a dime. So what that means is we are capable of that kind of radical change. And these excuses of, oh, we can't take care of the environment because it would be too radical. We can't get out of our oil and gas business because it would reshape our business too much or whatever. It turns out actually these are things that are eminently possible. And I think it's a time of terrible crisis and a lot of terrible things happening, and we should mourn those terrible things. But at the same time, I guess the silver lining is we've proven that we can make radical social change and that we should build on that.
Yeah, and I think we can also learn from past crises that, they need to be sustained. I mean, there's always a risk of organizational recidivism where we kind of drift back to where we were before, after sort of this burst of enthusiasm and so on. And so this is we hope that this is an opportunity to not go back to doing that and to keep moving forward. And again, this is also a time where we realize that information and facts and science is important, which makes us, as scientists and researchers, a bit more relevant, hopefully. And so evidence and continuing to do work to demonstrate the importance of equity and diversity and inclusion is ever more important at this time.
You're both talking a lot about innovation. I'm kind of want to turn towards some of the questions from the Q&A. There's a question about innovation, kind of a comment that often Canada is seen as not super innovative, kind of lagging on the innovation front, and asking whether you think businesses, particularly in Canada, can make these innovative changes now, or are there regulatory policy kinds of changes that might facilitate that innovation that would be necessary?
Do you want to start, Sumin?
So, okay. So, yeah, I think Canada is actually in a very unique situation. I think the mindset of Canadians are quite unique in that they're very open, and there's a lot of I would say compassion and empathy for people, and I think we've seen that across the board. And so with that, I think that there is that impetus and that motivation to change, to do better, and to show a bit more care and for themselves and others, right? And so I think from that regard, the individuals, the people themselves have this already, sort of innate interest and desire for change. And of course that needs to come along with other, it all is part of a system, right? And so individuals, organizations, and government need to pull together in the same direction. I believe that at this point we are ready for that.
I love that response, because as an immigrant to Canada myself and a new Canadian citizen, I think that's what attracts me the most, why I'm happy to be a Canadian, is exactly that collectivism that doesn't exist so much in the United States, which is my home country. And maybe this is a time when historically Canada hasn't been as innovative as the United States for a whole host of reasons, but maybe this is the moment when Canada has the opportunity to be more innovative, because we're already committed to these social goods that Sumin was talking about. It could be that this is now exactly the moment when Canada can take the lead, because we already know how to consider collective good as part of our decision-making process in a way that the kind of Silicon Valley go kind of mode of innovation they don't have skill sets to do exactly what Canadians have the skill sets to do. So Sumin makes me hopeful.
Let me ask, I'll take another question from the Q&A here, asking about how do you balance build back better kinds of ideas with the need for economic recovery and considering the financial pressures that businesses are under?
Yeah, I had an executive say to me the other day, I don't need a fancy new shampoo when my hair is on fire. And right, so but the problem with that is thinking of social good as a fancy new shampoo as opposed to essential for building back. I've also talked to other executives who said it was so clear to me how to make my decisions in terms of not laying so we talk in the business world about EBITDA, right? Earnings before, blah, 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 technical term for earnings. And what this executive said to me, she said, just screw EBITDA. Like, I'm not going to be talking about that right now. I'm going to be talking about how I maintain my employees, how I repurpose my supply chain to get PPE into people who need it. And I'm going to worry about that now. And I'm going to go to my investors and tell them that that's what we're doing. And that is going to be the foundation of my ability to build back, because that's going to make me stronger in the face of my customers going forward. And so I feel like the people who think of this as dichotomous are the ones who are going to end up just trying to fix the profits and having some of these long-term unintended consequences that Sumin was talking about. So I would say, I would challenge those who think that they're separate to say, no, what if you put that right in the equation of how you were dealing with your issues, your financial issues right now?
Yeah, I think we've talked about, we touched upon this a little bit already. I mean, to survive and thrive, I mean, businesses need healthy consumers, right? Functional societies, and a diverse and inclusive workforce. So we really should be doubling down on equity, diversity, and inclusion in our workforce, and not seeing those things as mutually exclusive.
Okay. Another question from the Q&A was back to kind of the innovation theme. And use the phrase collective trauma. Do you think the collective trauma we've been experiencing will impact our ability to innovate, and positively or negatively? And how do we mitigate that if that's a negative effect?
So to mitigate the negative impact, I think, these things, I think the ones that the companies and the organizations and groups that have been able to sort of to weather this crisis have been the ones that already have strong trust in the organizations and the groups, and so that comes from all the things that we've been talking about, right? Developing a safe environment, one that's inclusive, that allows people to be their best, and so building that type of culture in your organization is essential for mitigating any of these negative consequences.
But I don't think we should, put to the side the fact that this has been a massive trauma for many people, and there are going to be huge mental health repercussions for this, not just in, for example, the hospital workers dealing with the worst of the nursing home, care home workers dealing with the worst of the crisis, but for people who have been at home trying to take care of children and parents and still do their job. I think we are going to have to reckon with this, with the trauma from that. And I mean, I myself, I'm literally the most privileged person in the world. I can still sit at my computer and do my job, and I recognize that privilege. And even I feel pretty traumatized by a lot of the shifts and just seeing the police brutality and seeing the deaths from COVID. And so I think this is something that's going to affect our society. And my only hope is that it's going to affect society in a way that says people are going to really, really care about these kinds of issues that Sumin and I are talking about.
Another question in the Q&A about leadership style for kind of accomplishing these goals we're talking about in this context, and whether a more inspirational style, within this particular question, the juxtaposition was a more inspirational style or more autocratic style. So I'll leave that there. There are other questions of a similar theme using different words, but generally just this question of what kind of leadership style in this crisis moment and with these objectives of building back better might be most effective.
So yeah, so the question of leadership styles, from my perspective, I don't think that's a sort of a one size fit all type of leadership style. I don't know if one is always necessarily better than the other, and even in a crisis like this. But I think what some evidence that we've been collecting recently suggests that certainly a leader that is supportive in the sense that providing direction, but also taking care of the emotional needs of people is important. I mean, whether that people, kind of draw inspiration from that. Sure. Autocratic, autocratic styles tend to perhaps work or become more acceptable when there is a crisis where people are just, sort of in survival mode, and they're not, there's no time to worry about how you're feeling and, how are you today, and and all that sort of niceties. But in the current situation, I think both of those things are just as important. I think empathetic leadership has also been discussed in the literature, but how that allows leaders to respond more quickly to then get buy-in from the employees and the changes that have to be made. But at the same time, that can also have a downside where we're all sort of then trapped in this really strong emotions, and we have a difficulty in getting out of it, and sort of blurring of what needs to happen versus sort of being so in touch with with supporting and the emotions of your employees. So it's kind of, yeah, so I always shy away from saying that one style is always necessarily better. I think the style that's best is one that is responsive to your employees, to your workforce, and one that meets their needs. And so understanding what those are, I think, is first and foremost, and deciding how you want to lead your people.
And I just want to say, I think this juxtaposition between sort of the autocratic or something else may actually be wrong, in the sense that that may be embedded in a kind of traditional male notion of leadership. I mean, there's been lots of wonderful articles out there about how the countries that have done the best happen to have been led by women. And what you see in those cases is these leaders are not necessarily not being firm. They're being incredibly firm. I mean, look in New Zealand. The prime minister shut down the country almost immediately, incredibly firm, and yet at the same time, as Suman said, incredibly empathetic and incredibly relatable. And so I think that you don't have to give up being firm and authoritative when you are also simultaneously being caring. And I think the idea that those are have to be in contrast to each other, maybe based on an old model of leadership. And we're learning that there really is a new model of leadership, which we've been talking about for many years, but people find hard to adapt, that may be much more effective.
I wanted to ask another question from the Q&A. There have been a couple of notes about the nonprofit sector, and asking whether there's need for innovation there as well, and whether the nonprofit sector should also be thinking about building back better.
Well, just today, or maybe yesterday, there was an announcement that a number of major foundations in the US, MacArthur Foundation and others, are banding together basically to use debt to create a whole new fund that would allow them to invest massively in supporting the rest of the nonprofit sector, who is obviously suffering mightily right now. And that's not something that would have ever been considered before this crisis either. And so I think there probably are some real opportunities in the nonprofit sector to think very differently about how they do their business as well, or they're experiencing the pivot right now. The YWCA in Canada is doing a massive pivot in terms of how they can provide services, their social enterprises, all sorts of things. And they're going to learn a lot from how they can deliver services in the future by being forced to pivot right now. So I think we will see a flowering of innovation in the nonprofit sector as well.
Suman, do you have any further thoughts on that? No. I think that perhaps we have covered the majority of the topics raised in the Q&A. I'm just scanning through there a little more to see other broad themes. There was a question too about examples. Are there examples of firms that you've seen starting already to demonstrate the kind of good examples of what it means to build back better, people who are already putting into place innovations in response to this crisis and the budding recovery that kind of demonstrate some of the principles we're talking about today?
Yeah, Jerry, go ahead.
I'm not sure I think we're seeing a lot of companies doing things, especially around kind of enabling workforces and things like that. I have companies that went from 3,000 to 35,000 Zoom calls a day and things like that, learning that they can work in different ways. And I think there are many, many examples of organizations that have figured out, oh, we need to now do shift work because some people have to be caring for their kids in the morning. So they're going to start at 1 and go until 8. I think there's lots of examples of companies that have been, learned a lot on that front. I think where we're seeing, I will give you just more negative examples in the sense of firms that have said, oh, we're going to give to this charity or that charity as their way of responding to the crisis. And I think that can be important. But if that's what companies turn to, is again a side of the desk solution. Oh, we're going to give to this charity for COVID recovery, as opposed to we're going to actually think about how we do our business differently. I think that's where we have the missed opportunity. Not that the charities don't need support, they certainly do. But at the same time, if the reaction is that, it's not going to be great. And also, I think a lot of companies are discovering that when they furlough employees and they don't cut CEO pay, that can be a huge problem. And so we're seeing many companies that are actually seeing the CEOs forego their pay or radically reduce it. And I think that's the kind of innovation in governance and compensation that we're starting to see in a lot of companies too. But Sue-Min, you may have better ideas than me.
No, I think right now, I think there's just a greater awareness, right, of what our coworkers and our employees require and need at this time. And I think many organizations are more sensitive to those needs. And I think we're seeing changes even in the universities, or where we are right now. There's a lot more sort of understanding about how we make arrangements, and what's required, and whether flexible hours and working from home was such a sort of a difficult thing to even imagine. But it's happening, and it can work out really well. And I think that's promising for how we can move forward and implementing change. So I think that's happening in many, many places.
Thanks. I think we're about ready to wrap up. Then I'll just ask you each if you have some final summary comments that you'd like to share with us before we wrap up.
Well, Ken, I actually saw one of the questions, or several of the questions in the chat. Maybe we have a number of our own students who are watching have been asking about the future of MBA education. And I know you're very new into your deanly role, but I wanted to turn to you and just give you a chance to say, because we were already talking about the MBA is going to have to change and the world is changing. And now this has really accelerated what kinds of possibilities we could also imagine for it. So I don't know if I'm putting you completely on the spot, but
I saw that it was in
but
the
I did
Q&A.
see it in the chat.
Yes, I saw it in the Q&A, and I was a little bit hesitant to go there because I'm not sure that's of broad interest to our audience. But as you say, maybe quite a number of people are have a vested interest in the future of the Rotman School. I think it's I feel like also with the question about examples of firms that you see doing great things, I think part of the challenge in answering that question is part of the challenge I'll have in answering this question, which is it's early days, right? And so we're still very focused on just what are we going to do. I mean, it's early days for me too. I'm 4 days into my interim dean term, but it's early days in the recovery from the pandemic, right? So we are really thinking right now very hard about, first it was how do we get through the end of March, and then it was how do we get summer term mounted, and now it's how do we welcome students back safely and when. And I think we're going into each of those successive stages just kind of addressing the immediate questions as they arise, and in the context of a broader overarching strategy about about values like the health and safety of our students and employees being of primary importance, about continuing to strive for academic excellence and all the rest. But in terms of turning that into grand visions of the future of management education, I think it's one day at a time right now. But I do think, and it's interesting being and you guys have both been in leadership roles in the university as well in various capacities, but it's funny because you see it from both sides. You are actually managing an organization in a CEO kind of way while also talking about what CEOs ought to be doing. And it's a kind of conflicted position in that way. So right now, I think we're focused on managing our own progression, but certainly thinking about the content of what we teach, just not only how we pull it off as an organization, but the content of what we teach. I think it's going to be a great impetus for furthering some of the approaches and mindsets and content that a number of us have been championing for many years, but has maybe been slow to take up, around concepts like ESG and thinking about multi-stakeholder accountability and things like this. And the other thing I would say is, as Sarah said very early on in the conversation, we almost take pride in how slowly we change at the university, right? Everything gets several layers of scrutiny and evaluation by committees and goes through a governance process and so on. And so we often really take our time in changing. And I think what this has shown us is we can really change quickly when the will is there. And I think that's very invigorating for people in leadership roles. And so hope to harness that energy as we get a little breathing room from having gotten through this first wave of our own managerial challenges. So thanks for asking the question. There's a little bit of a preview of what's to come.
Well, I mean, only just because that exact example is the sympathy that I think we need to have for any leader of an organization. It's the same experience. It's like, you just needed to get through March. Now you need to just get through May. Now you need to figure out the fall. I think a lot of leaders feel like that's what's going on. And yet here, Suman and I have been saying, oh, and think about all of these other things as you do it. And so you know, what you pointed out is, okay, now as we plan for the fall, let's think about what we're actually teaching and bring that conversation to the forefront is exactly kind of what we're advocating for, which is don't just plan for the fall, but plan better for the fall, plan better for next year. And you know, we are the slowest changing organization and we've changed fast. So that also makes me quite hopeful. So, yeah.
Great.
Yeah, again, great opportunity where our minds are sort of shaken up a little bit, and I think we're ready for something different and radical, and maybe not that radical. I mean, as you said, these are ideas that have been discussed for a while now, but you know, this could be the time to really take a big step forward when you've recovered from the trauma and all that.
Right. Well, you know, and great CEOs say, you know, never let a crisis go to waste. And that's not to be flippant about the crisis at all and the terrible tragedies that are occurring. But if we don't use this as an opportunity to do all these things that have been floating around forever, wow, what a waste. Let's do it, you know,
Sure.
So
no pressure, Ken.
No. Okay. Thanks. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been a really great discussion and conversation, I think, and I know I am, and I'm sure many of the audience are, inspired to think about how not just to recover, but to thrive when the pandemic, or as the pandemic starts to pass and we get further into recovery phase. I'm sure you've given really great food for thought to many in the community, and with lots of insight that they can apply in their own roles. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the 9th episode in this webinar series entitled Managing Uncertainty. Our next webinar will be in July, on Wednesday, the 15th of July at 1 o'clock. I'll be joined by urbanists Richard Florida and Shauna Blair on a theme that ties in nicely with this topic. We'll be looking then at the impact of COVID on the future of cities. So if you've missed any of our previous webinars, you can find the recordings on the website at rotman.utoronto.ca. Thanks again for joining us today. Have a good day.